I never thought friendship could shatter so completely over laughter on a living room floor. The text message glowed on my phone screen at 8:17 a.m., each word cutting deeper than the last, transforming innocent moments into something unrecognizable. Someone had been watching me, judging, interpreting, condemning, and now the person I trusted most believed I had betrayed her in the worst possible way. Trust used to feel effortless between us. We moved through shared spaces with the comfortable rhythm that only develops when two people genuinely understand each other's boundaries. My roommate and I had built our friendship over 3 years of late-night conversations, shared meals, mutual support through heartbreaks and celebrations. We'd seen each other at our worst, feverish with flu, devastated after family loss, overwhelmed by exam pressure, and at our best. I thought we were unshakable. When she started dating her girlfriend 6 months ago, I was genuinely happy for her. After a string of relationships with people who didn't appreciate her intelligence or kindness, she'd finally found someone who matched her energy, who made her laugh until she couldn't breathe, who looked at her with unmistakable adoration. I welcomed her girlfriend into our apartment, made space for their relationship to flourish, adjusted to being the third wheel without resentment. That's what you do when you love someone. You make room for their happiness, even when it shifts the dynamics you've grown accustomed to. The girlfriend and I developed our own friendship gradually. We discovered shared interests in obscure documentaries and early 2000s music that my roommate teased us about. We occasionally grabbed coffee when waiting for my roommate to finish class. Nothing deep or exclusive, just the natural connection that forms when two people care about the same person. I respected their relationship completely. I had my own dating life, my own circles of friends, my own priorities and boundaries. In retrospect, maybe I should have maintained more distance. Maybe friendly should have stayed formal. Maybe every interaction should have included my roommate to prevent misinterpretation. But hindsight distorts as much as it clarifies, and I can't honestly say I would have done anything differently. Friendship shouldn't require strategic defense planning. Trust shouldn't be so fragile that laughter becomes evidence for prosecution. The night of the party arrived during a particularly stressful week. I'd been working double shifts to cover for a sick coworker while trying to keep up with midterm assignments. My boyfriend of 4 months had traveled home for a family emergency, leaving me without my primary emotional support. Sleep had become a luxury rather than a necessity. But when my roommate excitedly planned this gathering to introduce her work friends to her home life, I pushed exhaustion aside and promised to be present, to help clean the apartment, to make everyone feel welcome. I remember applying mascara carefully before guests arrived, thinking how nice it would be to relax for one evening, to meet new people, to temporarily forget the pressure of deadlines and responsibilities. I remember the hopeful feeling of putting on my favorite sweater, the soft blue one that always made me feel more confident. I remember thinking this night might be exactly what I needed: connection, laughter, momentary escape from the grinding routine of obligations. How quickly hope can transform into devastation. How easily a single interpretation can rewrite an entire history. The first hour of the party felt ordinary in the best possible way. Our living room filled with the comfortable noise of introductions and catching-up conversations. I navigated the initial awkwardness of meeting strangers with practiced small talk, asking about jobs and connections and interests. My roommate stayed close, bridging social gaps, visibly happy to have her worlds colliding in our shared space. Her girlfriend arrived with a bottle of tequila and immediately pulled me into a hug, familiar and warm. The alcohol flowed steadily, not excessively, but enough to soften edges and lower inhibitions. I paced myself, conscious of early responsibilities the next day, but welcomed the gentle buzz that made social interaction less effortful. Music played from the speaker system my roommate had carefully set up earlier, the playlist a collaborative effort we'd created together the previous evening. I didn't notice the exact moment the night shifted, when observation began and judgment formed. I wasn't performing for an audience, I was simply existing in what I believed was safe space. When my roommate disappeared into the bathroom with one of her coworkers for what turned out to be nearly 45 minutes, I found myself suddenly adrift in a sea of unfamiliar faces. Social anxiety, the kind I'd managed for years but never fully conquered, tightened around my chest like an invisible corset. Her girlfriend noticed my discomfort. Or perhaps she felt equally displaced without her partner present. Whatever the reason, we gravitated toward each other naturally, finding familiar territory in shared connection. We sat cross-legged on the carpet, comparing stories about my roommate that made us both laugh. When I attempted to change the music and dropped my phone, cracking the screen protector, but not the phone itself, we both dissolved into the kind of helpless laughter that only seems to happen when you're tired and tipsy and trying not to wake neighbors. "Let's not tell her I broke your stuff," she whispered through giggles, extending her pinky finger toward mine in an absurdly childish gesture that seemed hilarious in our slightly intoxicated state. I remember thinking how nice it was that my roommate had found someone who could be both mature and silly, someone who complemented her more serious nature. I remember feeling grateful that I got along with her girlfriend, that our apartment could be comfortable for all of us. I remember feeling nothing remotely inappropriate. No attraction, no boundary crossing, no betrayal of trust. The bathroom incident happened shortly after. Her sudden dash toward my bedroom door, my panicked follow-up when I remembered my cat's accident. The brief, practical interaction as I cleaned the floor while she waited. The kitchen shots afterward, celebratory, lighthearted, entirely innocent. Nothing felt wrong or inappropriate or worthy of concern. Nothing felt like it would become evidence against me in an unexpected trial. I went to bed shortly after my roommate emerged from the bathroom, exhaustion finally overwhelming social obligation. I hugged her goodnight, smiled at her girlfriend, thanked the designated driver for being responsible, and retreated to my room. I fell asleep easily, unburdened by guilt or worry, or the knowledge that someone had been watching me through a lens of suspicion. The morning's text message was an earthquake that demolished the stable ground I thought we stood on. The accusations landed like physical blows. Flirtatious behavior, inappropriate closeness, secretive interactions, suspicious movements. Each charge represented a complete misreading of my intentions, a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I value. My roommate, my friend, chose to believe the worst interpretation of my character based on observations relayed by someone who didn't know me at all. My initial response was pure disbelief. Surely, once I explained the context, clarified the misunderstandings, reminded her of our history and my own relationship status, everything would return to normal. I typed a careful response, detailing each moment from my perspective, emphasizing my straight identity, my ongoing relationship with my boyfriend, my respect for her partnership. I expected immediate understanding, perhaps even an apology for temporary doubt. Instead, I received stubborn certainty. She knew what her coworkers saw. She couldn't ignore the patterns of behavior. She had to protect her relationship. Each response revealed a person I didn't recognize, someone willing to discard years of trust and knowledge based on a virtual stranger's interpretation of facial proximity and laughter. The apartment transformed overnight from sanctuary to hostile territory. Silence filled spaces previously occupied by comfortable conversation. Bedroom doors remained firmly closed. Kitchen usage became a carefully timed dance to avoid simultaneous presence. Text messages replaced face-to-face communication, even when we occupied rooms separated by mere feet. The girlfriend stopped coming over entirely. Friends chose sides without fully understanding the situation. Social media became a minefield of cryptic posts and conspicuously absent interactions. Mutual acquaintances exchanged uncomfortable glances when we appeared at the same events. The story traveled through whispers and DMs, undoubtedly morphing with each retelling until I couldn't recognize my own actions in the versions that occasionally reached me. My boyfriend tried to understand, offered support and indignation on my behalf, but couldn't fully grasp the devastation of losing a friendship so suddenly, so completely, over something so fundamentally untrue. How could I explain the disorientation of having your character rewritten by someone else's perception? How could anyone understand the peculiar grief of mourning a living person who sits 20 feet away? Nights became exercises in silent crying, muffled by pillows to prevent sound from traveling through too thin walls. I replayed every interaction with her girlfriend, searching desperately for anything that could have been misinterpreted, anything I should have done differently. I questioned my own memories, my own intentions, my own understanding of appropriate boundaries. When someone you trust doubts your character so fundamentally, you begin to doubt yourself. Sleep evaded me most nights. Appetite disappeared. Academic performance suffered. Even my relationship began feeling the strain of my constant emotional exhaustion and insecurity. The foundation of my daily life had been pulled away, and everything built upon it became unstable as a result. The cruelest part was the absence of closure. No final conversation, no mutual understanding, no agreed-upon narrative of what happened. Just silence and distance, and the slow poisoning of memories that had once been precious to me. Even in the midst of grief, after previous friendship endings, I'd always had the certainty of knowing why. A specific disagreement, a betrayal, a natural growing apart. This nebulous accusation based on a stranger's interpretation left me grasping at shadows. 3 weeks into this Cold War, I reached breaking point. Emotional limbo couldn't continue indefinitely. Either we needed to address the situation and find resolution, or I needed to remove myself from an environment that had become psychologically unsafe. With trembling hands, I wrote a letter, not a text message that could be screenshot and shared, not an email that could be forwarded, but an actual handwritten letter expressing my hurt, my confusion, my willingness to examine any genuine concerns, and my need for either reconciliation or release. I slid it under her door on a Tuesday morning before leaving for class. By the time I returned that evening, her response sat on my own desk. 2 sentences that simultaneously ended and began something. I need space to think about everything. Please respect that. Not closure, but at least acknowledge. Not reconciliation, but at least communication. It wasn't enough, but it was something to hold on to while I navigated the wreckage. Uncertainty is its own form of torture. In the weeks that followed the letter exchange, I existed in a state of suspended animation, not moving forward toward resolution, not returning to comfortable familiarity, just floating in painful limbo, while awaiting someone else's decision about my character. The physical symptoms of prolonged stress accumulated gradually. Tension headaches that started at the base of my skull and radiated upward like invasive vines. Stomach problems that made eating a strategic negotiation rather than a pleasure. Insomnia followed by exhaustion, so profound that I sometimes fell asleep during lectures, my body forcibly claiming what my racing mind denied it. A persistent cold that lingered for weeks, my immune system compromised by cortisol and sleeplessness and nutritional neglect. My relationship suffered collateral damage. My boyfriend tried to be understanding, offered support that I couldn't fully receive, suggested solutions I couldn't implement. But my emotional unavailability and constant preoccupation created distance neither of us intended. Our conversations increasingly centered around my situation rather than our connection. Romance yielded to crisis management. Eventually, he suggested taking a break until things settled down. A compassionate exit disguised as temporary pause. Yeesh, I wouldn't blame him. I had become a shadow version of myself, obsessed with vindication, consumed by injustice, incapable of being fully present for anything beyond my own wounded rumination. Who would choose to build a relationship with someone so utterly absorbed in proving their innocence? My academic performance plummeted despite desperate, all-night study sessions. Information refused to stick to a brain preoccupied with replaying social interactions and imagining worst-case scenarios. Participation grades suffered as I became increasingly withdrawn in classroom discussions, afraid that any contribution might somehow be misinterpreted or used against me. A professor pulled me aside after class to ask if everything was all right at home. My first indication that the internal chaos had become externally visible. Work became both escape and additional stress. I picked up extra shifts to avoid the apartment, but customer service requires emotional energy I no longer possess. Plastering on a smile while internally disintegrating took a toll that manifested in forgotten orders, mishandled payments, and customer complaints. My manager, typically understanding and flexible, delivered a formal warning about performance expectations. Another foundation threatening to crumble beneath me. Friends grew weary of my singular focus. Maybe you should just move out, they suggested with increasing frequency. Maybe it's time to let this friendship go. Logical advice I wasn't emotionally prepared to accept. Moving meant admitting permanent fracture. Moving meant financial strain I couldn't afford. Moving meant acknowledging that something precious had been irreparably damaged based on misunderstanding I couldn't correct. The lowest point came on a rainy Sunday evening when I found myself sitting on a park bench 3 miles from campus, soaking wet and unable to recall the walk that had brought me there. Dissociation, a term I studied in psychology but never personally experienced, had apparently become my mind's defense against unbearable present reality. The cold rain eventually brought me back to awareness, but the frightening gap in consciousness shook me deeply. That night, huddled under blankets and still shivering hours after returning home, I forced myself to confront a difficult truth. I was destroying myself over someone else's perception. I was allowing a misunderstanding to dismantle every aspect of my life. I was becoming unrecognizable to myself in pursuit of recognition from others. Something had to change, and since I couldn't control my roommate's beliefs or choices, the change had to begin with me. The realization didn't transform everything overnight. Epiphanies rarely translate to immediate behavioral change. despite what inspirational social media posts suggest. But acknowledging the self-destructive pattern created space for small, deliberate adjustments that gradually altered my trajectory. I started with physical basics, the foundation that had been most severely neglected. Regular meals, even when appetite was absent. Scheduled sleep, supported by meditation apps and sleep hygiene practices I'd previously dismissed as unnecessary. Exercise that forced my body into exhaustion, more productive than mental spiraling. Water instead of the excessive coffee that had become both meal replacement and anxiety amplifier. These weren't revolutionary changes. They were fundamental maintenance that stress had overridden. But addressing physical needs created bandwidth for addressing emotional ones. The mind operates differently when the body isn't in constant distress. Next came professional intervention, an overdue acknowledgement that this situation exceeded my coping resources. The University Counseling Center offered limited but valuable sessions with a therapist who specialized in interpersonal conflicts. She didn't validate my every feeling or demonize my roommate. Instead, she offered perspective I'd been too close to see, that the accusation likely revealed more about my accuser's insecurities than my actions, that the intensity of my reaction signaled the importance I placed on moral integrity, that rebuilding required accepting that some perceptions cannot be changed regardless of truth. You cannot control what others think of you, she said during our third session. But you can decide how much power their thoughts hold over your life. Simple words that landed with unexpected force. I had been living as if vindication were oxygen, essential for survival. But what if it wasn't? What if I could breathe freely even while misunderstood? The question unlocked something. Not immediate healing, but the possibility of it. Not instant peace, but its eventual approach. I began reconstructing daily life with this new understanding. Academic recovery came first, meetings with professors, honest explanations of personal difficulties, negotiated extensions where possible, acceptance of some irreversible consequences where necessary. One particularly compassionate instructor allowed me to submit an alternative assignment that actually incorporated elements of interpersonal perception and misunderstanding, transforming painful experience into academic exploration. Work performance stabilized as I compartmentalized more effectively. Not perfectly, but enough to remove immediate threat to employment. I scaled back hours slightly, acknowledging that financial pressure was preferable to complete burnout. The extra time went towards sleep and study and slowly rebuilding a social life that had withered during my isolation. Friends responded to my gradual reemergence with varying degrees of patience. Some had moved on, finding my extended preoccupation with the conflict exhausting. Others welcomed me back without judgment, offering support without demanding explanations. I learned something valuable about friendship in the process, that some are seasonal, some are situational, and some are sustaining across contexts. All have value, but discerning the differences prevents disappointment. The apartment situation remained complicated. Awkward silences and careful scheduling continued, but my response to them shifted. Where once I'd felt constant anxiety and desperate need for resolution, I began treating our limited interactions as practice in emotional regulation. Each encountered without expectation became an opportunity to reinforce my developing independence from others' perception. My roommate remained distant but civil. Occasionally I caught her watching me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Not hostile exactly, perhaps curious or confused. We exchanged necessary information about bills and maintenance issues through brief texts. The girlfriend no longer visited when I was home. I chose to view this as respect for my space rather than admission of inappropriate behavior. 6 weeks after the initial accusation, I received an unexpected text message from my ex-boyfriend. He'd been thinking about me, wondering how things had resolved, open to meeting for coffee if I wanted to talk. I surprised myself by declining politely. Not from lingering hurt or resentment, but from honest recognition that our connection had served its purpose in both our lives. We wished each other well and meant it, a small but significant healing. The most profound shift happened internally, almost imperceptibly. The desperate need for vindication gradually transformed into something quieter but more sustainable. Self-knowledge. I knew my own intentions. I knew my own boundaries. I knew my own truth. External validation would always be welcome, but was no longer necessary for peace. For the first time in months, I began sleeping through the night. Spring arrived with characteristic unpredictability. Warm sunshine followed by freezing rain, blooming flowers covered by late snow, consistent only in its inconsistency. My internal landscape mirrored this pattern. Progress wasn't linear. Some days brought surprising lightness and clarity. Others dragged me back into rumination and hurt. But the overall trajectory moved toward healing, however, unevenly. Academic performance recovered gradually as concentration returned. Not to previous excellence, that would require another semester of rebuilding, but to respectable competence that wouldn't derail future opportunities. Work stabilized into sustainable routine. A tentative social circle reformed around shared interests rather than shared history. Small pleasures returned, enjoying music without analyzing lyrics for relevant meaning, reading fiction without searching for parallel conflicts, laughing without self-consciousness about who might be watching or interpreting. The apartment remained emotionally complicated territory, but no longer dominated my mental landscape. I had established external spaces that provided necessary escape. Study rooms, coffee shops, friends' apartments, campus benches that caught afternoon sunlight. Home became just one context among many, rather than the central stage for ongoing drama. 3 months after the initial accusation, something unexpected happened. I arrived home from an evening class to find my roommate sitting alone at our kitchen table, 2 mugs of tea steaming before her. She looked up when I entered, nodded toward the empty chair across from her, and said simply, "Can we talk?" My heart raced with familiar anxiety, but something had changed in how I experienced the sensation. Nervousness without dread. Uncertainty without catastrophizing. I sat down, wrapped my hands around the offered mug, and waited. The conversation that followed wasn't dramatic reconciliation or complete absolution. It was something more complex and ultimately more valuable. 2 imperfect people, acknowledging the damage of miscommunication and misinterpretation without fully resolving every disagreement. She didn't retract the accusation entirely. She still believed her coworker had seen something worth noting, still felt boundaries had been insufficiently maintained. But she acknowledged that intention mattered, that a single incident viewed through a particular lens shouldn't outweigh years of demonstrated character, that perhaps jealousy and insecurity had colored both her interpretation and her reaction. I didn't claim perfect innocence. Perhaps subconsciously I had enjoyed the attention and connection with her girlfriend during a vulnerable moment when my own relationship was strained. Perhaps physical proximity, while laughing, could have appeared intimate to an outside observer without context. Perhaps clearer boundaries would have prevented misinterpretation entirely. We didn't emerge as restored best friends. Too much had happened, too many words exchanged or withheld, too many feelings formed and solidified. But we did emerge with something valuable, mutual recognition of humanity beyond black and white categorization of villain and victim. The conversation created foundation for peaceful coexistence during our remaining months as roommates, if not the deep friendship we once shared. "I think we both learned something from all this," she said as our conversation concluded. I nodded, understanding the truth in her observation, despite its simplicity. Sometimes the most profound lessons arrive through the most painful experiences. That night, I wrote in the journal my therapist had suggested, a practice I'd initially resisted as cliché but gradually embraced as genuinely helpful. Today wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about proving my innocence or securing apology. It was about something more important, remembering that every person exists within their own reality, interpreting the world through lenses shaped by personal history and fear and desire. Understanding doesn't require agreement. Forgiveness doesn't erase hurt. Moving forward doesn't mean returning to what was. Sometimes growth means accepting that relationships transform into something unrecognizable from their beginning, and finding peace with that evolution, rather than fighting against it. The words weren't particularly profound, but they captured something truthful about my changing perspective. I closed the journal feeling lighter than I had in months, unburdened by the weight of needing specific outcomes or vindications. Whatever happened next, whether friendship rebuilt in modified form or civil acquaintance maintained until lease end, I would navigate it with greater emotional resilience than before. For the first time since that morning text message shattered my sense of stability, I fell asleep without replaying conversations or constructing defenses. Just breathing quietly in darkness, present in my body, anchored in self-knowledge that no external interpretation could shake. 1 year later, I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, watching summer sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. The gentle weight of my cat settled against my leg, his purr vibrating through denim. A half-empty glass of wine rested on the small table beside me. My current roommate, A graduate student I'd met through campus housing services, moved around the kitchen inside, preparing dinner with cheerful efficiency. The previous year had reshaped me in ways both visible and invisible. Visible. A new haircut that required less maintenance during stress periods, weight redistributed from stress loss and recovery, clothing chosen for comfort rather than impression. Invisible. Boundaries established with greater intention, relationships evaluated for mutual respect rather than history, self-worth derived from internal compass rather than external validation. My former roommate and I had maintained sporadic cordial contact after our lease ended. Occasional text messages about mutual acquaintances or practical matters related to our previous apartment. Once, unexpectedly, a coffee meeting that felt stilted but not hostile. We occupied different orbits now, connected by memory rather than current experience. I wished her well genuinely, without expectation of renewed closeness. Her girlfriend, the unwitting catalyst for so much upheaval, had apparently moved to another city for graduate school. My former roommate had decided not to follow, choosing local opportunities instead. I learned this information through mutual friends, with the detached interest one might feel about characters from a book read long ago. The accusation that once felt world-destroying had diminished to appropriate scale. An unpleasant misunderstanding between young people, still learning how to navigate complex relationships. Not insignificant, but no longer defining. One chapter in a longer story rather than the entire narrative. My phone buzzed with a message from my current partner, someone I'd met in an art class I'd taken for stress relief during recovery. Our connection had developed slowly, cautiously, with explicit communication about boundaries and expectations. The relationship felt fundamentally different from previous ones, built on mutual growth rather than mutual wounding, on shared presence rather than shared drama. The message contained nothing extraordinary. Just confirmation of weekend plans, a small joke about something that had happened in their workday, a simple expression of affection. Yet its ordinary warmth filled me with quiet gratitude for how far I'd traveled from the person who once believed vindication was necessary for happiness. That evening, watching stars appear one by one above the city skyline, I reflected on the strange gifts that sometimes arrive disguised as devastation. The accusation had initiated painful but necessary growth, forcing examination of how much power I gave others' perceptions, how reactive rather than intentional many of my relationships had been, how much personal worth I'd invested in being universally liked and understood. The experience hadn't made me cynical about friendship or trust. If anything, it had clarified the difference between authentic connection and performance-based approval seeking. My circle now contained fewer people but deeper connections built on mutual understanding rather than convenience or history. I'd learned to value those who sought to understand rather than judge, who asked questions before forming conclusions, who recognized complexity in human interaction. Most importantly, I'd developed a relationship with myself that could withstand external misinterpretation without disintegration. The desire for universal understanding remained, that seems fundamentally human, but the need for it had transformed into appreciation when it happened rather than devastation when it didn't. As twilight deepened into proper darkness, my roommate called that dinner was ready. I gathered my cat and wine glass, took one last look at emerging stars, and turned toward warmth and connection awaiting me inside. Whatever misunderstandings tomorrow might bring, whatever perceptions others might form, I carried the hard-earned knowledge that my worth existed independent of interpretation, constant as those stars, regardless of who was watching or what they believed they saw.